We are live today. We have very specially gift wrapped and packaged, pre-packaged just for you for your viewing pleasure. Eric Hernandez. Yes, Eric Hernandez, the one and only. He is a local apologist, and he's got his own set of ideas on consciousness and the soul and things like that he's been shopping around in debates and been presenting different places. So welcome, please, Eric Hernandez. Eric, you want to introduce yourself? Eric Hernandez.
Yeah, how's you guys doing? Thanks for having me on. Yeah, like you said, my name's Eric Hernandez. I am the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. That encompasses anything from doing apologetic training with the churches aligned within Texas Baptist, going and ministering at the churches, doing even training with some of the leadership, and of course anything involved with apologetics, whether it's online, doing YouTube videos, doing debates, as you guys know. Anything involved with an apologetics, it's a dream come true, and there's a whole Cinderella sob story behind that. But suffice it to say that God has been really good, and more good than He should be with me, and I get to do this for a living.
Yeah, that's cool. So getting into apologetics, there's a story behind that. What like tell us about that?
Yeah. So anybody who's heard me before know the story, but for those who aren't familiar with it, so see how far we want to go. So I remember one time in youth group, my youth pastor said that if someone ever told you to prove to them God exists, you merely had to say, "Well, prove to me He doesn't." Right? And I thought, well, that's brilliant. I'm gonna put that in my back pocket, and anytime I need it, I'm gonna pull it out, and that'll be my ace in the hole, if you will. Um, when I graduated high school, I look at my first year of college and my freshman year of college. And I'm looking to take some electives, right? Some blow off classes. And I saw philosophy and it looked kind of fun. And I thought, man, I could take, maybe skip a few times if I need to. One of those blow off classes, right?
Right.
And then first week of class, though, the professor, who I later came to find out was an atheist, but first week of class, he says, this week we're going to talk about something called the burden of proof. And the notion behind the burden of proof is basically that anytime you make a claim that something is true, then you then bear the burden to prove the claim that you're making. He said, so
Right.
as a random example, and again, I told you later, I found out he was an atheist. He said, if you're a Christian here today and you claim that God exists, you believe that statement's true, then you now bear the burden to prove what you believe is true. However, he said, if you tell the person asking you to prove it, if you tell the person, well, prove to me He doesn't exist, he said that is inappropriately shifting the burden of proof, because given that you made the claim, you bear the burden. And I kind of felt like my house of cards collapsed there, right?
Right.
And it was something really challenging, something I hadn't heard before, but at the same time, it was something that I welcomed. To just kind of fast forward, I learned a lot in that class. I really did. I really enjoyed it. I fell in love with just being able to think that way, because in my youth group, I got in trouble a couple of times for asking questions. It was freeing, if you will. Now, I want to take my second class in philosophy, and everybody's telling me, okay, if you're going to take another class of philosophy, whatever you do, don't take Professor Pena's class. He's an atheist philosophy professor. He's known around the campus and school for being very hostile and antagonistic towards Christianity. And, people were telling me, I had some of my peers telling me, if you take his class, you might lose your faith. And my
Oh
thought was
wow.
honest. My thought was
Wow.
honestly,
Interesting.
sign me up,
Yeah.
not
It's
because.
like the setup for God's Not Dead. It's like the setup for a Christian movie, inspirational film.
Well, actually, it's so funny you brought that up. He actually first public debate 5 years after I graduated there. And I usually ask people, "Have you seen the movie God's Not Dead?" And people say yes, and I'm like, "Well, I can't stand that movie," but it's the same principle where you have somebody debating their professor of philosophy. But anyway, so I take his class because in my mind I was, well, I was never an atheist, so I had my doubts, right? I had my questions, things that I wrestled with, and
Right.
I remember thinking to myself, if Christianity is true, I need to know why. But at the same time, if Christianity is false, then by the same token, I should know why as well. And perhaps this is a guy for the job. Now, here's a pivotal moment for me of how I got into apologetics, and more specifically, philosophy of mind. Um, I remember we walk into class, and he's sitting at his desk, which was in the front of the class, and that's where he would lecture from, oftentimes sitting down. And he kind of reaches into his pocket and he pulls out what looks to be like an antidepressant pill or something.
A what?
An antidepressant pill.
Oh wow. Okay.
And he says, and this is how he starts the class. He says, now religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And according to Christianity, this is something that is immaterial. And within your soul is where your emotions, your beliefs, your moods, all these things lie. He said, but here's the
Wait,
thing.
let me ask you a weird question before you go on.
Sure.
What year was this roughly when you took this class?
That would have been 2000 and probably 6 or 7.
So someone is able to have a college course and basically started out like there's no God. Imagine like if God, imagine if a Christian did that at college, they'd be crucified if they start out like, I'm a Christian professor and Jesus is the Lord. And so, okay, go on. Just a little aside. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. No, it's fine. So he says, now he said, here's a problem. If the soul's not physical, and these are where your moods lie. He says, and how is it that I can take this antidepressant pill, which is physical? And if I take it, it has the ability to change my moods, change my thoughts, change my feelings and my emotions, and possibly, that would change my behavior. He said, now, how would you explain that something tiny and physical can affect the allegedly soul, which is non-physical? Because every time you look at the brain, all you see are neurons firing. And every time we look at the body, we just see these base elements. We see the chemistry, the carbon, the oxygen, the hydrogen, but you never find anything like a soul. And according to Christianity, it's because of the soul that we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our friends and family that have passed away. He said, but how do you explain this? That you're just something physical, but your soul's immaterial, and you take this pill that's physical and it affects the soul. He said, well, I'll tell you how. It's simple. He said, the answer is simply that there is no God, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no soul, there is no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body, a meat machine, and we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives and stop believing in these foolish fairy tales, right? Class dismissed, pretty much. Now, what this did for me was, up until that point, I had encountered atheists before, and most of what I heard were really just complaints, in my opinion. To this day, I still.
Wait, cut out.
Uh-oh. I think we
I
might
can't
have
hear
lost him.
I can't hear him.
Yeah. Hopefully he'll be able to come back.
Did he drop from the chat?
Yeah, like his video's frozen too. Well, sorry everybody. we'll try
that
to
was
get
like
him
the
back
best,
on
John. That was the best part.
I didn't do it. Blame the internet.
Oh, yes, you did. Oh, blame the
okay,
internet?
fine.
I blame you.
I did.
I hold you personally accountable for that. So
I just wanted a chance to talk for myself.
Yeah. So tell us about the soul, John. Well,
okay.
I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, he was just leading me in anyway, so I could get to talk about the soul. It's all bunk. It's all made up. We're all just meat machines. No, don't worry. Oh man, yeah. So he completely dropped from the call. He should be trying to coming back soon. So I'll be sure to add him. But
I may have to go to the car. My wife is out shopping right now.
Okay.
So
how you been, Craig?
I've been very well. We had a cool chat with John Vervaeke yesterday. That was everything you expected it to be, right?
Yeah, good point. Yeah. We should shout that out on the Beverly channel. Craig, myself, and a couple others interviewed Professor John Vervaeke from the University of Toronto regarding his YouTube series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And so we've been going through like all 50 of his lectures and then discussing them afterwards with each other. And
he was really kind of brilliant in person, right? Like, how quick his mind. I mean, it's what you would expect, but
yeah, even more so than that, because like he was right on top of all the questions that we were giving to him, and we like spent quite a bit of time working on those questions, and he was able to like really respond to them very insightfully and with a lot of respect.
Yeah, he's a first-rate intellect. His mind is like electric. That's the only downside to his class probably, is that he pours so much information out of his mouth that it's hard for a lot of people to process it all correctly. That's what I think, but I don't know. What would you say?
No, yeah, that's probably a good critique.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
So you're back.
Okay. So I don't know what happened. What I just went ahead and did just connected to my phone. Right, my internet cut out for some reason. I don't know what it was. Where did I leave off at?
You were telling us you think that a lot of atheists are anti-theists more than atheists, but you'd interacted with some atheists at college, and there was a professor who was like
yeah. So, can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, yeah. So, what I found was, so up until that point, I heard complaints against the existence of God, but none of these complaints would really bear any weight to show Christianity wasn't true. But here's for the first time in my life that I heard an objection that, if true, would mean that Christianity was false, because Paul said that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then our faith's in vain, and we should be pitied amongst all men. So if there's no resurrection, according to Paul, then Christianity can't be true. By the same token, I would argue if there's no soul, then by default there can be no resurrection, and if there's no resurrection, once again, Christianity can't be true. So here was, for the first time in my life as a freshman in college, hearing an objection that, if true, I would have to say would mean that Christianity would be false.
Okay,
And
gotcha. Yeah.
in other words, I'm sorry?
No, I totally understand the logic of what you just said. So go ahead.
So it wasn't one of those things I can just brush off, and it wasn't something like, where I hear just, honestly, a lot of times atheists, where they would just complain like, oh, look at this or that, or well, why is there this or that in the world? Well, it's not really an objection towards the existence of God, right? Because God can still exist even if those things are true. But if there's no soul, like I said, I would say Christianity is false. So long story short, this was something that really challenged me. And I'm not the kind of person to just brush something under the rug. I'm the kind of person that asks questions and wants to find out answers. So it was here where I kind of began to just really dive deep into, philosophy and studying things like metaphysics and answering questions of the existence of the soul. And I would say it's, to this day, it's one of the areas that I've studied most, so much so that the last car that I bought is actually a Kia Soul, because that's how influential the subject was in my life. And the most influential person, my favorite philosopher, is Dr. J.P. Moreland, who's an expert on the soul. And back in November, he spoke at one of our conferences we had, and it was a real pleasure getting to drive him around in my soul. So,
And did you say to him, by the way, I bought this because, well, it wasn't technically his influence, but okay.
yeah,
So
that's it. Largely, yeah, it was his influence.
So start us off with substance dualism and explain exactly what that is.
Sure. So I hold to what's called substance dualism, and to kind of boil it down in a simple way, so you can think of substance dualism as there was two kinds of substances when we're talking about human beings. There's a body, which is physical, but then there's also an immaterial substance. Now, one of the complaints I hear a lot, especially lately, because I've been doing a little bit more online stuff on the soul, is people saying, well, a substance cannot be immaterial. Well, anyone who would have that kind of objection just kind of goes to show that they're not familiar with the terminology within the field of philosophy of mind. This isn't something I'm making up. This isn't my quote idea. This is the kind of terminology that's being used within philosophy of mind. And that term substance doesn't inherently mean something physical. It just literally means to be under, to substance, to stand under. Like a submarine is something that's under substance in the same way. So substance dualism is the idea that the version I hold to is the idea that I am a soul. So technically speaking, I don't quote have a soul, but quite literally, I am a soul, but I have a body. So I have a body. I don't have a soul. I am a soul, and I have a body. And a body without a soul is just a corpse. And here's where I usually make the joke and say, well, actually, I actually do believe that I actually have a soul. I do now have a soul, and it's a Kia soul. But I've already used the joke, but it still applies, and worth every penny to make that joke. So in substance dualism, I am a soul, and when I use the word I is an indexical word that refers to something specific. So if I use the word here or there or that, that's an indexical word that is pointing or alluding to something. When I use the word I, you can put the word I equals soul, the self, the subject. So I am a soul. That would be in essence a picture of what substance dualism is, without getting into the argument so far. But let me know where you want to go from there.
Well, one of the things that you brought up that's kind of related, that was, I thought, the best point you made in the Matt Dillahunty debate. When you were talking about how the person transcends, it's very related to the substance dualism, and you can fill in how it's related to the soul. But you talked about John Smith gets hit by a car. John Smith is in a coma. John Smith is still John Smith, just in a coma. So there is something essential to a person that transcends the physical person. There's something that transcends the sum of his parts. Right. Is that kind of the right summary?
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, that's in the right ballpark. So when I give a case for the soul or defend the existence of the soul, and as you alluded to, anybody who wants to watch can go on my channel. Just type my name, Eric Hernandez, and you can see my 2-hour debate with Matt Dillahunty on the existence of the soul. When I argue for the soul, there's two basic points I touch on. The first point is that consciousness is not physical. And then the second group of points I touch on, the second group of arguments I use to touch on a point, which is what you're alluding to, is the point that I am more than a brain and body. So the first point, consciousness is not physical. Second point, I am more than a brain and body.
Right.
And from there, I would conclude, you're a soul. There's a lot to go into, but what you're alluding to is could be an argument either from identity through change or the argument of how we ground personhood. So let me unpack that.
Sure.
First, it's important to understand the difference between a purely physical object, like an aggregate, and a substance. So things like Legos, which I recently heard Legos is not the plural of Lego, it's just Lego, but I like Lego.
I think that was
better to me.
JB. I think it was this. We know that the little smart aleck who pointed that out. That's JB. He's our local pet atheist. I swear to God,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that was him who challenged you on Lego. Almost
And I
positive
don't
he
mind
said.
that.
No, I know.
I really
But
don't mind it.
he's just being a little Weisenheimer. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I'm admittedly probably still going to use Legos just because it feels much more comfortable to me. But see, things like cars or watches or Legos are aggregates. They are a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, the thing when it comes to aggregates versus substances, there's a lot of key differences. So one key difference, let's look at identity through change. So if you were to take a tire off of a car, then the tire remains a tire, meaning its existence and identity. Identity is a technical term in metaphysics, meaning what it is. It remains a tire independent of its connection to the car, which tells us that when it comes to aggregates, the existence and identity of the parts are not necessarily dependent on their connection to the whole. So a tire remains a tire even when it's not connected to the car. However, the inverse is not true, namely that a car cannot be a car without its parts. So take something like a tricycle, for example. It's important to keep in mind that for aggregates, purely physical objects, their existence and identity is necessarily dependent, or we can say ontologically dependent, on the existence and identity of their parts. If you take a tricycle, by definition, has 3 wheels. Remove one of the wheels and you now have a bicycle, which means a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come to be. Why? Because with aggregates, again, their existence and identity is ontologically grounded in their parts. Now, contrast that with a substance. So something like myself, I am a substance. What are the characteristics of a substance? Well, if you were to chop off my arms and legs, would I still be a human person? Yes.
Yes.
So that immediately shows us that having arms and legs is not what our identity is grounded in. In other words, my existence and identity as a human person is not necessarily grounded in my existence and of my arms and legs, especially if you consider someone who maybe was born without these things. Are they still human persons? Now, if your answer is yes, I can go a lot deeper, but let me wrap that part up.
My answer is yes. So if you chop off your arm, I'm still Craig Reed. If you chop off my arm, I'm just Craig Reed without an arm, and I can't do some things that I was doing before quite easily.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So you've lost function. That's an undeniable. But if you're still the same person, then it follows that however you ground identity as a personhood, it cannot be grounded in something physical. It must be grounded in something transcending the physical. And I would say, namely, something like the soul. So now what you're alluding to about identity through change hits a little bit of a different angle, which I like hitting it at. So suppose it's alleged that every 7 to 10 years, you replace virtually every cell in your body. Suppose 7 to 10 years ago, somebody commits a crime. Let's say there was a murder 7 to 10 years ago. But it's not until 7 to 10 years later that the police actually find the evidence. And they come to this person's house. They knock on their door and say, we have the evidence to convict you. We know it was you. And imagine the person saying, well, officer, time out. Don't you know we're nothing more than brains and bodies? And 7 to 10 years ago was a completely different set of cells and parts together. It wasn't me, go arrest that guy, but good luck because he doesn't exist. Of course, they're going to laugh at you, and that's not going to fly in court. Why? Because we know that persons retain identity through change and part replacement. So if you can replace my parts and I'm still me, then once again, it follows that my existence and identity cannot be grounded in something physical, but instead must be grounded in something that transcends the physical, namely the soul.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward without calling it the soul, but the idea being that the sum total of your personhood transcends the individual parts. And I'm sure atheists have objections on some grounds already, but keep going with what you're going with.
Yeah. Well, let me put
That's
it
the
in
basic gist of it, though, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So to
So
put
keep
it in a
going.
syllogism, we can say something like, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or I am an immaterial substance, a soul. Well, if I am a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change. However, if I do retain identity through change, then it follows that I am more than just a purely physical object. Therefore, based on those premises, I am a soul. It really is that simple, especially when you put into that syllogism. So another thing we can look into an argument would be the indivisibility of personhood. So
Right.
when you with this argument, it's important to understand some terminology once again. And of course, they are complicated arguments, and sometimes I hear this as a complaint against the position, which I think is completely absurd. I mean, you look at any field any field, there's going to be there's going to be things that are complicated, but that's just part of life, right? I mean, if Christianity were true, then I don't know how anyone would expect to just get any and everything by just a 1 hour conversation. So
Right.
obviously, if these
Totally.
things do exist and they're true, then I don't see how someone as a non-believer can complain or use it as if that somehow makes it less true, right? I mean, yes, you have to think to be a Christian.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to the indivisibility of personhood, the first thing that would be important to talk about would be the notion of degreed and non-degreed properties.
Oh, hold on.
And
That's my wife. Hold on a second.
sure, no problem.
No, babe, I didn't. What's going on? Are you coming back?
I just muted him for that. That's the thing with Craig. He's just kind of like the eccentric sort of, I don't know, boomer, really.
No worries at all.
Yeah. So, you want to carry on with what you were saying there? Sorry, just for the audience to sort of catch.
No, that's all right. Yeah. So, and for anybody interested in the argument, I go over it a little bit in more detail. I get on my YouTube channel. Not that I keep trying to plug it, but there's only so much I can get to in the short amount of time.
Right.
And there's other videos where I go through it extensively. In fact, I debated Tom Jump, and we got into this subject. So on my review video, I actually go into this in detail.
Okay.
Now,
And we do
about
have your YouTube channel linked down below for everyone as well.
Thank you. Awesome. So
I'm back.
So let's look.
So,
Go ahead.
no, I'm back. Just wherever I left, wherever you left off, we're good to go.
Gotcha. So the notion of a degreed property or non-degreed property is important to understand. So a degreed property or
My
something
wife is
like,
bringing me home a cheeseburger, so that's a good thing. That's
Right
what
on.
that phone call was about. Yeah, that's
There you go.
good. That's good enough. Go ahead.
So something like the property of being loud or hard are what philosophers call degreed properties, which means they're properties that can fluctuate or come and exist in percentages or degrees. So the property of being loud can be louder or softer, and the property of being hard can be harder or softer. So degreed properties are properties that can fluctuate. They can be divided. Now
Right.
contrast that with a non-degreed property. So a non-degreed property would be something like the property of being even. The number 2 and the number 6 are both numbers that possess the property of being even, but no one would say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2 because evenness is a non-degreed property, which is to say it's an all or nothing kind of thing. It can't be divided. There is no in between. It either is or it isn't. Now, with that in
Right.
mind,
So there's no shades of even, like there's a shade of gray.
right,
It's even or
exactly.
it's even. It's even or it's odd.
Absolutely.
Take it or leave it. Case closed. Whereas
Absolutely
there's
right.
okay, go ahead.
So now let's apply this to being a person. Now, every human being possesses a property of personhood. Now, the question would be, is personhood a degreed or non-degreed property? This is something that when I talked with T. Jump, he seemed to at first kind of try to avoid that, but then eventually bit the bullet, and you see where this goes to. But when you look at personhood, we can put this in a syllogism. I am either a purely physical object or I am an immaterial substance. Soul, call it what you want, right? So if I'm just a purely physical object, then personhood is a degreed property. However, if personhood is not a degreed property, then it follows that I am not just a purely physical object, I must be something more, therefore I am a soul, I'm an immaterial substance. Now, how do we know this? Well, ask yourself this question for those listening. Typically, men are larger than women, right? And if all we are nothing more than a purely physical object, then personhood would be dependent on the amount of mass and matter that you have. Now, if a male is typically larger than a female, then would it follow that men are more portions or more intrinsically valuable than women? Well, if your answer is no, well, then you would have to concede with me that personhood is a non-degree property. And if personhood is a non-degree property, then the property of being a person cannot be grounded in something physical. Otherwise, it would be something that fluctuates. If it's not, and if everybody, whether you're 3 or 4 or in the womb or 50 or right about to die, if you're still a human person with intrinsic value, then it follows you cannot be reducible or limited to something just merely a physical object like a brain and body. It must follow that you're something more than that transcends the brain and body. And you can tie in the other argument, which we can also ground identity through change. So if person has a non-degree property, then it follows that the soul must exist and you cannot be more than just a purely physical object.
Got it. Okay, so two questions. One is, you probably know Thomas Nagel, right? He's an atheist philosopher who's
absolutely.
on somewhat of the same page.
Yep.
But how is he just? I don't quite. I've never read him, but I understand that he is arguing against materialism as an atheist. How is he doing that? And how is he doing that? First off, let's start there. How do you?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure you probably know his work, right?
Yes. So so this would go more into the first point whenever I give the case for the soul, namely that consciousness is not physical. Now, again, there's a lot that could be said here, as with everything, but basically you have this consciousness is something that's incredibly unique to the universe. It's unlike anything that exists, and there's a number of reasons for that. But I'd say atheists, and he is an atheist, Thomas Nagel, atheists like Thomas Nagel, and you could throw in there Frank Jackson, who's an agnostic. You can throw in John Sorrow, who's an atheist, and other philosophers of mind, Jaegwon Kim, who recognize these problems that consciousness is a kind of thing that you can't just get from rearranging particles of matter. Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, and it has a long subtitle that I used to quote it all the time. I keep forgetting, but something like "Why the Neo-Darwinian picture of evolution is almost certainly false," or something to that extent.
Okay.
Where he's basically arguing against naturalism, and he's basically saying that the problem is, if evolution is a picture of getting physical chunks of matter and rearranging them, and you get more complicated chunks of matter, but you can't get consciousness arising from this, because consciousness is what philosophers call sui generis. It's something completely new. Now, what some atheists would often argue is, well, wait a minute, consciousness could just be an emergent property.
Yeah, I heard Matt Dillahunty argue that. That was
right.
One of his counters.
Yeah, and that's a popular position, and they'll usually point to something like water. They'll say, that oxygen does not have the property of being wet. Hydrogen does not have the property of being wet, but when you put them together, it becomes water, and then it has a property of being wet. So you have an emergent property. Well, first I'd say consciousness is not merely reducible to properties. But that aside, even if I grant emergent properties, when you look at something like water, you're showing physical stuff producing more physical stuff. That's the first thing I'd say. You're not showing consciousness.
That's a no-brainer.
So the second point I make is that, first of all, I would say that we know consciousness is not physical. How do we know this? There's something called Leibniz's law of identity, which basically states if two things in question are the same, then whatever's true of one is going to be true of the other, and vice versa. But if in principle you could find something true of one that's not true of the other, then they're not the same thing. So here's an example. Suppose I walk into a lab and I see two bottles of clear fluid, and one bottle says water and the other bottle says chemical X. I want to ask the question, are they identical? Which in philosophy means, are they the same thing? So I look at their properties and I notice that they both have the property of being a clear fluid. And based on this, I say, okay, they both have the property of being a clear fluid. So far, I think they're the same substance, right? But then I turn over chemical X and it says caution flammable. And I think, okay, well, I know water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know they cannot be the same thing.
Right.
So Leibniz's law of identity gives us that good rule of thumb that if you can find something that is assumed to be the same thing as whatever you're talking about, it would just be like, if I say water and if I say H2O, typically we're just using two names to refer to the same substance. But if you can find in principle something true of one and not the other, then they're not the same thing. Now, apply this to the mind and brain. Let me come out and say this. As a substance dualist, I would define the soul as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body, which means consciousness is a capacity or faculty of the soul, which means it's your soul that thinks, not your brain. And it's your soul that has thoughts and beliefs and desires and all these conscious states, not your brain. And we can get to that a little bit. But basically, why would I argue this? If there is no God, and all we can explain our existence is through a physical process of natural selection and evolution, which is fine with me. If God used evolution, whatever, I don't care. That's not the point of the argument. So I don't want anybody listening to go on a tangent on that. Simply put, if we grant for the sake of argument that this is how we came to be, then the most logically consistent position I would say is physicalism, right? That you're just a purely physical objects of physical properties and states. If that's the case, then if consciousness exists, it would have to be reducible to something like the brain. It would have to be reducible or identical to some purely physical object. So the question would become, is consciousness nothing more than the brain? Is it a purely physical object? And the answer is no, and it's easy to see. Going back to Leibniz's law of identity. Take your conscious states. There's 5 conscious states. You have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition or acts of will, whatever you want to call it. Well, let's take something like my thoughts and beliefs. My thoughts and beliefs, which are a state of my mind, they can be true or false, but no state of my brain is true or false. That doesn't even make sense. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you guys right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana is not 7 inches long. And I can give a dozen more examples, but the point is clear, namely that if all the properties of the mind are immaterial and all the properties of the brain are physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it cannot be reducible or identical to merely something physical like the brain. And therefore, if consciousness exists, it must be immaterial.
Right. So in other words, tell me if this is a correct reframing. So in other words, if Matt Dillahunty says it could be emergent property, he's saying hydrogen, hydrogen and oxygen. There's no hydrogen. There's no reducible part of your consciousness where you can say, here's the hydrogen, exactly. Here's the oxygen, right. Where you can actually, so it's irreducible. And there's a thing that Sam Harris said recently, where he said, an atheist said, it seems to be that consciousness is by definition miraculous, or something along those lines. And so that's kind of what you're arguing for, right?
Right. That it's not right. That the what's called the hard problem of consciousness, and this is what I was getting at to what you asked about Nagel, is that these people who study these things, and I want to make that clear, this is not a quote Christian position, although obviously I think this fits perfectly at home with the Christian worldview. Right. But there are atheist scholars who study philosophy of mind who know this stuff, and they say, yeah, consciousness is not something that you can just get like a structural property, which is something like.
So okay, wait, let me ask you a question though. So how is Nagel? So how is Nagel circling the square? He recognizes that it is an immaterial substance, but he still says there's no God. So what is he saying is going on?
Right.
A miracle without a God, or like what? Like what's his?
That's essentially. I mean, what's funny is so someone like I think it's gosh, I forgot his name, but he says something like, how does evolution take natural processes and produce something like the wine of consciousness, right? He's alluding to Christ's miracle of turning water into wine. He said basically evolution would have to turn this biological water into conscious wine. Now what Nagel does is like most philosophers who study this stuff and are looking at this, like John Sorrow, again, people like Thomas Nagel will say, if we can't get consciousness by just kind of changing the parts and moving around the Legos, and obviously I'm oversimplifying for the sake of argument, but if it can't be that way, then it must have been there all along.
Right.
So how do we explain consciousness? Well, perhaps it's the case that consciousness has always existed potentially in everything that exists. So he holds to what's called a type of panpsychism, which means, and this isn't a far cry from simplifying his position. So basically, any physical piece of matter, potentially, if you rearrange it the right way, could become conscious. Because the point is, consciousness must always be there from the beginning, since it could not have arisen through a physical process. It could not have emerged from a physical process. So it must have always been there. So it must be the case that everything at some extent has a potential to become conscious, and that's called the panpsychist position.
So like a rock is potentially consciousness if you rearrange. That's basically the argument, right? That's cray. How on earth does he
Yeah.
does it? That's great. Is that really the argument, that if you rearrange the particles of a rock, it's potentially conscious and it's been there all along?
Now
They're just like us. They're just like
Yeah.
us. But a carrot is just like Greg Reed. If you just jigging with the mechanics of a litter, it'd be talking to you. Is that
Right,
kind of what
yeah.
he's saying?
Yeah,
Is
I
that
mean,
correct?
yeah, I mean, he'll dress it up more, you know, and I want to be fair to him, and I want to say this too. I mean, you know, God bless him. I mean, that's I think that's the only hope you can have to explain consciousness, is to basically presuppose it's just always been there. Well, why do you say it's always been there? Well, because it can't come from anything physical, so it must have always been there. Or how about God exists, right?
Right.
But right. So what he's going to have to say is, he might say, well, it's not that simple, you know, Craig. It's a little more complicated than that, because we may not know the necessary physical conditions that it takes for consciousness to rather for consciousness to, I forget how he words it exactly, but basically there has to be a certain type of physical interaction, connection, and conditions for consciousness to basically come out of what's already there. And we may not know it, but yes, that's the best explanation we have if we want to avoid anything supernatural like God. So
Right, because let
yeah.
me studiously avoid the supernatural or the
Sure.
theological implications of my position, even though even props to him, because he's honest enough to be a non-materialist,
Right.
because the science is probably starting to establish that as an actual fact, given all the breakthroughs in quantum mechanics and things like that. That's probably a no-brainer. But then you have a problem as to how could it be, and it's hard to answer that problem without some form of a miraculous. That's what you're saying, correct?
Right. And now Thomas Nagel is one of those atheists that you know I really like, especially when he just comes out and says what he really feels and is honest. Thomas Nagel's on record for saying, it's not just that I don't believe in God, I don't
I'm a
want
Christian.
God to exist.
I'm a Christian. It's not record. I'm actually a Christian. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm
Go.
sorry.
No, he's on record as saying, I'm actually a Christian, guys. I'm calling myself an atheist for years, but
Yeah.
technically I can't work it out any other way. So hallelujah.
I know, right?
Sign me
Yeah.
up.
Yeah, that'd be great. You know, I'll be praying for him. But no, he's on record for saying, not only am I an atheist, I'm not just an atheist. I don't want God to exist. I don't want to live in a universe where God actually exists. So he's trying everything he can, admittedly and openly, to avoid any kind of those conclusions. So yeah, and that's kind of the route that he's forced to take. And like you said, he's at least honest enough to reject materialism. And a lot of people try and point to quote science, or, you know, some people say, well, if you just understood the neuroscience, you would understand. Well, first and foremost, don't tell me that, tell Nagel that, right? Tell one of the top 50 scholars alive today that he doesn't understand neuroscience. And on top of that, I would say the question of, with philosophy of mind, the question of the soul, of consciousness, neuroscience has virtually almost nothing to do with the question. I say virtually almost nothing. I can get to that a little bit more later, but I can give you quotes of neuroscientists who would say something like this and say those kind of questions are best left to the philosophers.
Or the
Questions of consciousness.
priests, or they'd say, or the priest, and that's where we step in and go, yes, those are left to us, my children, right?
So any of this, obviously, you know, is going to require philosophy. So it's not physics, it's metaphysics. Now, what people will try to allude to is also something like, well, look, Eric, if you damage the brain, you can damage something like memory. And I say, yep. And they say, well, how can that be? And I say, well, what do you mean? What's your confusion? Well, if you damage the brain, you can damage memory. And I say, yep. Well, how is there a soul? And I say, well, I don't get the confusion, because it's basically this question begging assumption that just because you can show a correlation between two things, therefore therefore there is only one thing we're talking about. Jaegwon Kim, again, an atheist, basically alludes to the fact that just because you can show a correlation doesn't mean you've explained it, because correlations are not explanations. They are the very thing that need explaining. The analogy often.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Well, I was going to ask you a better question along those lines that I thought up myself. Not necessarily hard to explain. I'll give you the question and see what you do with it. So, for example, when we're talking about the total personhood, Ronald Reagan had a very strong persona that was distinctly Reagan-esque, right? Unique to him, transcends all of his unique attributes. So lines up perfectly with what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So Ronald Reagan, towards the end of his life, got Alzheimer's, damaged the brain, and to all accounts, basically his soul, whatever the transcendent element that is uniquely him, disappeared according to his children. It wasn't the same. It was the same body, but he had left the building. How do you explain that with your framing? And I know there's an explanation. I'm setting you up.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's fine. So a few things. So apply that inversely. So when you were 5 months old, right, you weren't talking the way you do, you weren't acting the way you do. But would you say that whoever existed at 5 years old no longer exists and now that person's completely gone? Or would you say you've matured or developed and you're the same person, you've just added or taken away some characteristics? I would say the same thing would apply to something like in the illustration you're giving. So when the soul's embodied, it's dealing with a brain and body, and much like a musician has a guitar, if you detune the guitar, you're affecting the music. It's not as if detune the guitar means that the music that you used to play no longer exists, or it's just gone. But it shows that there is a deep correlation and cause and effect relationship between the mind and the brain. So yeah, you do things to the brain, you're going to affect the way the person acts or functions or even thinks. Does it mean that, quote, the person before no longer exists? No, it's the same person. They're just now limited in various functions and capacities.
Right.
So
And well, even the framing of the question presupposes the answer, because
yeah,
they're acknowledging a total personhood, and they're
right.
acknowledging that you've damaged the brain and you've damaged the total personhood. So they're presupposing what you're arguing, that there is a total person that transcends all of its parts, and you can damage it out of existence isn't really relevant, is how I would say. But go ahead.
Well, yeah. So, in other words, to what you're saying is, just because you can damage a guitar so much so that it can no longer play the same song you were playing before, doesn't mean that there was no song there in the first place, or that the song or that the notes are in the guitar. When I break open a guitar, I don't reach in there and pull out, oh, look, here's a note C, here's E flat, because again, there may be a cause and dependence relationship, but it doesn't mean they're the same thing. It's not a relationship of identity; it's cause and effect. So, in the
Right.
same way. Like to what you're saying, yeah, you can damage the brain, absolutely. And this is, and this, when people tell me this, it's like, no way, really? Like, wow, because you think we've just discovered this, what, in the past 50 years? No, they knew about this. I mean, even the Egyptians knew that if you hit somebody over the head really hard, you're going to mess up their memory, but they still believed in an afterlife. So it's not as if belief in the soul is somehow an ignorance of neuroscience. And again, there are neuroscience
Right. Or
who study
they
this
didn't
stuff.
notice that if you could box someone up in the head and damage their brain for life. They noticed that it wasn't
Right.
their belief in the afterlife wasn't contingent on the fact that they didn't. Yeah, I totally know what you mean. That's a silly objection. A lot of the objections are silly. They're just
Right.
not clearly thinking about what you're saying usually. But go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you hit it spot on. I think a lot of people just haven't thought through these things. So the objections that they throw out there are just
Yeah, automatic knee jerk. I know science better than the Christians.
right.
So here, you didn't really read the
Sure.
science book because here's this irrelevant thing about science. And you're like, well, no, it actually doesn't apply. Here's an analogy. And then they'll go, analogy? Well, I thought I wanted an answer. All right, never mind.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
and you have Nobel Prize winner like John Eccles and is it Karl Popper who believe in much of what I'm saying, and they're Nobel Prize winners, neuroscientists. So it's not as
Right.
if you understand the neuroscience, all of a sudden you don't believe in the soul. Like that it has virtually nothing to do with neuroscience. So, anyways, I've said that before, and I'll go wherever you want to go. But the point simply is that it's not any belief you have regarding consciousness or the soul or whatever position you take, whether it's substance dualism or panpsychism or property dualism. All these positions are going to be what's called empirically equivalent, which means there is no amount of scientific data that is going to lend credibility to one of you over the other. And there is no neuroscientific data you can show me that I'm going to disagree with, meaning you and I are going to disagree. Me and an atheist are going to agree on all the scientific data you can find till you're blue in the
Right.
face. I'm not going to disagree any of that because our disagreements are not scientific, they're metaphysical. It's how
Right.
we look at the data and explain it metaphysically, because the data is only going to go so far,
Right.
which
But
I think even go
ultimately
ahead.
your argument though is deeper, because what you're truly saying is if you truly understand the science and drill down on the science and you understand the science perfectly and moving forward to its finest tune, you are going to come up against an inescapable conclusion no matter what, that consciousness by definition miraculous, because there's going to come up against there's I don't know, that's what it seems to me like the obvious. But go ahead. I'll
Yeah,
see if you
no,
think that.
yeah, right, yeah, and that's what a lot of people have come to see, and that yeah, this isn't you don't. There's nothing about the brain that you look at and say, yeah, this is definitely going to give me consciousness. Alvin Plantinga wrote an article called "Against Materialism." It's really good. He touches on what Leibniz even touched on. where he kind of has this thought experiment that he says, so consciousness has properties like intentionality. So this is the property of being of or about something. So I'll put it this way: when I'm hungry, my neurons aren't hungry. I'm hungry, which I think, again, no brainer. It already shows that I am not my neurons. And when you break everything down to the base particle, like a quark, quarks aren't hungry. Quarks don't have beliefs. Okay, well, let's get a billion of those and put those together. Let's get an atom. Okay, still no belief, no hunger.
Right. So in other words,
there's
there's really, you're saying there's no way you can locate it in the material at all, because once you break it down to its most minute thing, the material is not going to express the intentionality. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, there's not even that potential there, right? I would say it's metaphysically impossible. It would be like trying to, because these are structural properties. So when you look at structural properties, take a pile of 10 wooden boards and you call it a pile of boards, but then you rearrange the structure.
Hold on. I gotta get that. Hold on. I'll be back in a second.
He's a popular guy, you know. You're saying that about the boards?
So you take a pile of 10 wooden boards
mm-hmm.
and you rearrange them, it can become a raft. So that's a structural property where you get the base elements and you arrange it, and you can see it's conceivable to look at a pile of wooden boards and say, yeah, I can see how that can become a raft.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that with anything like consciousness in the brain or any kind of matter, which is, again, why Nagel points out the problem that it has to be fundamental. Consciousness must be fundamental.
Right.
Now, with that in mind, what he was saying there was, yeah, if you really understood like the ins and outs of the matter and the physics, you're going to see that it becomes a category error to try and assume that consciousness can come from this. I use this example. It's like if you take one red brick
mm-hmm.
and then take 1,000 more, and then let's say 2,000 more, and you make a house out of it, you now have a red brick house. How many bricks would you have to add or take away, and what arrangement or structure would you have to give it in order to get the color blue? Well, that's just that's a category error.
Right.
In the same fashion, in other words, what people say is, well, this is an argument from ignorance. No, it's not an argument from what I don't know. It's an argument from what we do know.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, no one's going to say, well, Eric, you just don't know how many bricks it takes and what arranged structure it takes to get the color blue. That's an argument from ignorance. No, I'm showing demonstrably it's a category error to assume that a rearrangement and structure of certain pieces of matter are going to give you consciousness, much like a rearrangement of red bricks is going to give you the color blue.
Right. Yeah. Like it, and I guess that makes sense for why Nagel, then being a panpsychist, would have to hold in to every single atom at least has some sort of potential to be conscious.
Absolutely.
And
right.
It has to be arranged in this particular way so that you can have this sort of consciousness emerge out of that, because it's actually coming from the lowest level in a sort of sense.
Right. It's already there at the fundamental level. It's all that potential is already there. Right. And that's and I think that's the best bet you have. And I mean, if someone wants to believe it, by all means, I mean, you could look up panpsychism memes or something like that. I remember seeing a meme. I love philosophy memes, and it had, you know those little, like, you go to the arts and crafts store and you can get those fake eyes that you can shake them and they move.
Uh-huh.
And one guy like bought a whole bag of those and just put eyes all over stuff in his room and at school, and like on his toaster and on his fridge and his microwave. And he's like, "This is panpsychism."
Right. Yeah.
What is? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
What does panpsychism technically mean? It means you.
So psych would allude to consciousness or the mind, and then pan meaning in all, kind of like a pantheist or a panentheist.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay.
So
and
everything has a little bit of psyche to it, like sort of like every atom sort of has a bit of a soul, at least, as well.
Yeah, and they might not use that word soul, but they're going to focus more on the conscious aspect of it.
Okay.
Because that's usually what everybody goes to when people think soul, they think consciousness. While that is definitely a big aspect of it, it's a lot more to that. But that's one of the main problems that I think is, because consciousness is undeniable, right? I mean, somebody could bite the bullet, like Matt Dillahunty. He could bite the bullet, and in my debate said, "I'm not the same person from one moment to the next," which I think is absurd. Tom Jump, same thing. In my debate with him, he said, "I'm not the same person from one moment to the next," and I said, well, how many times have I been talking to in the past hour and a half? I've been talking to 10, 15, 16, how many have I been talking to? If you're not the same person from one moment to the next, well, that's the only position you have to take if there's no soul. But that aside, someone could bite the bullet there, right? But you're going to have to sound really crazy to say that you don't believe consciousness exists, because that very belief is essentially to say that if beliefs are part of consciousness, then to say consciousness doesn't exist is essentially having to say that you believe there are no such thing as beliefs.
Yeah,
And
it's totally self-defeating and absurd. And also also like when you fall asleep at night, there was a back and forth of, I forget a little bit with the Shannon, where she was asking, and you came up with an example. When you fall asleep at night, you're still you. You're not consciously perceiving yourself as you, but you're still you, right?
right.
So
Right. Yeah. Because so what people try to do, because you said, what are the objections that you're sure some atheists have objections to this. So when it comes to identity through change, there's really there's like three options. Setting the soul aside, you have two. You can ground identity through change in your conscious mental experiences or in your body. Both have problems. We already talked about how it can't be the body because you're constantly replacing cells and whatnot. And it's literally not the same thing. Now, someone might say, well, who cares if you just replace a little bit? You're still you. This gets into what's known as a thought experiment of the sheep of Theseus. And I use a more modern example of like a car, and I put it this way. Suppose you take all the tires off a car, and I ask people, is it the same car? And I say, well, but wait a minute. Before you answer that question, suppose we change more parts and more parts. And let's say over a period of, let's say a few years, you change every single part on the car. Is it the same car? But before you answer that question, suppose I still have those replaced parts. I take all those replaced parts and put those together. Now I have two cars. Which one's the original? Now, whatever your answer is, the point I think is simple and clear. They both cannot be the original, which means at some point they cease to be the quote original car. Well, to just go ahead and throw it out there, I believe the moment you change anything when it comes to physical object, it's no longer in the literal sense the same thing. If you're just a brain and body, you're just a physical object. And once you change anything, you're no longer the same person. Now, with that being said, when the two ways people try to explain that without appealing to something like a soul or God to explain the soul would be, well, your conscious experiences. And this is where what you're saying. I had a talk with Shannon Q, which is also on my channel. She said, well, well, why can't we ground being a person in just your experiences and who you are? And I said, well, because what if you got in a car wreck and you got in a coma, and when you came out of the coma, you didn't know who you are, you didn't know that who you're married to, like everything that you used to know, and all your memories are gone. Are you the same person? And she said, well, she would ask that person, do you feel like you're the same person? And whether the person said, she'd kind of take their word for it. And I said, well, that's fine if you do that, but there's a difference between how someone perceives themselves versus whether or not they are in fact the same person. Because there's another thing to think about. What if that same person, you say, are you the same person? Are you still John Smith? You just got in a car wreck. Are you still John Smith? And he says, well, I don't think so. I don't remember being married to Susie, and I don't remember having 3 kids. I don't think that's me. Well, let's suppose about a month after therapy and counseling, the person says, you know what? I just got all my memories back. I actually am John Smith. Well, which is it? Was he John Smith the entire time? Or was he John Smith? He ceased to be John Smith and somebody else existed. And then when he got his memories back, then he's John Smith again. Right.
Right. Totally.
I don't think you can have something come into existence twice. The other thing they can try to appeal to, and by they, I mean people who reject the soul, is you could say, well, you ground it in a body. We already explained that with the car example and the tricycle example. Anytime you replace parts on a physical object, it's no longer the same thing.
Right. And the example that I use is the argument that's being put out there is that you are attached to you being the conscious agent perceiving yourself. You're not. You fall asleep, it's still you. You wake up and now you are perceiving yourself as you, but you don't have to technically be doing that in order for it to be you. It's the same example that you use, basically just restated a different way.
Yeah, sure. With regards to, because we're constantly gaining new experiences and stuff like that, right? So you're always adding or even taking away. I forget pretty easily, right? So if I forget, am I still the same person? Well, sure, but
right.
But it doesn't follow that I'm someone different.
So it seems to me like the only option moving forward, assuming all your science is correct, and I'm assuming that you have links to the neuroscience and all that. I'm just taking a guess you do because it sounds legit to me. Is that the only option philosophically to circle the square, if you're not going to say that there's a God, is like some sort of third way, like there's an energy Taoist thing, man, that's transcends reality. There's some sort of third way in between thing because you're definitely not your physical body. I think what you're saying implies that strongly if it doesn't in fact prove it, right? You're definitely not. So there's almost no other option than there's something else. There's something else going on here. You know, there's a mystery here that isn't 100% clear, right? I mean,
And that's panpsychism, yeah.
right. So you got to find some funky, like, esoteric, you know, kind of middle of the road, like, yeah, exactly, like panpsychism or Taoism. But John, are there questions, by the way? Are people asking questions in the chat? Is he still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, we've got quite a few people in the chat. We can start taking questions from people right now. In fact, Gavin was just asking if there was going to be Q&A. So yes, if people have questions, go right ahead, and you can either tag me or I'll be able to track them as well. So
okay, cool. So throw them out. Is there?
Okay. Yeah. You actually got Steve McRae. I think he met you in Texas, Eric. He was saying,
Steve, yeah.
Yeah. He said you're doing great. He was wondering if you would be up for having a conversation on his channel about all of this as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
In fact,
Cool.
he brought up the topic of mereological nihilism. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. Yeah. So yeah, mereological nihilism, telos. Yeah, it should be a good conversation.
Steve was in a debate on Monday on atheist, agnostic. It was. I only watched like 20 minutes of it, but it was good. The part I watched was good.
Oh yeah, it was a very good debate.
In fact, I don't know if he could answer or not there, but I thought he was going to be debating Jump on something like that. I wonder what happened there. Hopefully not stirring the pot or anything, but
no, yeah, I'm familiar with that. In fact,
Jump said he could kill you in that debate, Steve. not to stir things up, but Jump said he'll prove that there's which one? That all atheism means is a lack of belief in God. T Jump said he will prove that to you personally, man to man. Not to stir the pot.
Well, that was the thing. He was actually supposed to meet in person with Steve around the same time that James was setting up the debate between Destiny and Vosh. But T Jump got sick, so he wasn't able to join, and so they had to sort of delay or cancel that debate. Hopefully, they're going to bring it back up because, yeah, T Jump has some sort of interesting viewpoints on epistemology that I'm really hoping that Steve will be able to sort of school him on.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I'd love to see that. I love Steve. You know, I've heard him a few times, even before I ever met him. I remember one time looking at the Non Sequitur show. This was a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember thinking, I like this guy. You know, I think I like this guy. He's honest. You know, he's going to push back on the Christian. He's going to push back on the atheist. And, you know, he's trying to be objective, and I can respect that. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what we love about Steve too. All right, so let's see. There is a question, or I guess sort of a statement from Mark Angelotti. He was saying that DNA replication is the thing that makes us feel like we are the same person from one moment to the next. I guess kind of conceding the point that there are a numerous amount of yous that we're talking to just over time, not going to be the same person at all that we see.
Oh, and I have a question too that reminds me after he answers this.
Yeah.
So is a question, can we just point to DNA as a thing which maintains our identity change? Is that what they're asking?
I guess so. Yeah.
If that's the case, twins have identical DNA. So you'd have a problem immediately there. And then if I can modify my DNA, you know, if that's even if it's not scientifically actualizable right now, and it basically it just kind of pushes a goalpost into another area, but you still have the same problem with anything physical. If anything can be altered or changed, and you have something like twins who have identical DNA, if I'm not mistaken, they've even found people with like identical fingerprints. It's incredibly rare, but I think that's happened before, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, you would still get into a lot of problems with there's no way to maintain that continuity of identity to change.
Right. Yeah. I was actually, the way I was sort of taking the question, it almost seems like he was conceding the point that continuity of identity doesn't exist, but rather through natural selection, we've just happened to come to these beliefs that we are a continuous being, and then that's been somewhat
right. He's basically
successful.
saying it's an illusion, right? Is that what he's saying?
Seems like it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Can I
and
ask?
if that's the case, the funny thing is that the person who started typing that sentence is not the same person who finished it.
Yeah, so sorry we didn't get to answer the question for that Mark, but hopefully the future Mark that is
Right.
hearing this will be able to maybe pass the word along to him at some point.
All right,
Yeah.
let me ask you a question specific to a point you brought up in the Schuyler debate. When you were talking about evolution, you said that something can present to you an evolutionary. I think this is what you said. Something can present to you an evolutionary advantage, but not be technically true. Is that what you said?
I don't know if verbatim, but basically the evolutionary argument against naturalism is an argument from Alvin Plantinga, and it gets into the fact that in a nutshell, your brain is not designed to obtain truth. And here, the illustration I use is, suppose you wake up from a nap and you look at the microwave and it says 12 o'clock. And on that
Yes,
basis,
this is
you
what I'm
form
talking
the
about.
belief. You form the belief that it is 12 o'clock, but then you feel it's really hot in the house and you see that there's water under the fridge and you think, the power went out. And then when you look back at the fridge, it's actually blinking 12 o'clock. So you know the power went out, and that's what happens when the power goes out. It blinks 12 o'clock. So you ask yourself the question, is it 12 o'clock? Well, the question isn't necessarily no, and it's not even yes, it's I don't know. But if I'm going to base my beliefs that it is 12 o'clock on the reading of the microwave, then I now have an undercutting defeater, which removes any justification that I have for trusting in the reliability of the reading of the microwave. In principle, if there is no God and our brains have just come about through natural selection, which is a mechanism that would not aim for truth, it would aim for survival, which means any beliefs we have would have to be something that has in some way, form, or fashion aided in granting adaptive behavior that helped us survive. And if that's the case, then it would follow that our beliefs don't have to be true for us to survive and give us adaptive behavior.
They
They
just give
only
us
have to work.
they give us
Right.
an edge over the competition, and you could probably find a way that a delusion could give you an edge over the competition and allow you to
Exactly.
reproduce more successfully without technically being true.
Absolutely. And that's the point there. So much like the microwave, if that's how your brain came about, it's not a mechanism designed for truth. And you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces. And if your brain produces a belief there is no God, then you now have an undercutting defeater for rejecting that belief as true or valid because the way your brain came about. So you shouldn't, you have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces. So it's kind of like, I like to put it this way, kind of tongue in cheek. If there is no God, then the brain is nothing more than a glorified magic 8-ball. Nobody grabs a magic 8-ball and shakes it and says, will it rain? And it says yes. And you think, oh, well, there it is. Well, of course not, because a magic 8-ball wasn't designed to obtain truth. It was designed for entertainment. So if there's no God, your brain's nothing more than a glorified magic 8-ball, and there's no difference. Except for one difference is that if you actually turn over the magic 8-ball, on the bottom it says made in China, which means we at least know that the 8-ball was actually created and designed, whereas the brain still wouldn't be.
Did you catch that, John? Your brain was only designed for entertainment. You were designed only to entertain us.
It's failing. I don't know what's going on. Yeah.
More or less, that's what he meant. You were designed. You shake John and he gives you weird answers. It's the same idea, basically.
That's me. Yeah, give me a big old shake. We got a question from Gavin Herleman. He's I guess raising this sort of an argument for the resurrection of Jesus. So the resurrection was easily falsifiable, and the Jewish authorities had the most to gain by Jesus staying dead. Doesn't their silence about Christ being risen speak volumes? Or I guess silence against Christ being risen speak volumes, maybe. That's what he's saying.
About the authorities?
Yeah, like the authorities had the motivation and the capabilities of falsifying the claims made by the early Christians, but yet the fact that they didn't, I guess, indicates that he really was raised.
Yeah, and I said, hey, Gavin, good to talk to you via however you want to consider this method. I appreciate the comments you put in the videos and for the support and watching. I really do appreciate that. Yeah, no, absolutely. That wouldn't go as far as to be enemy attestation, but it would go as far as to say, had there been a body there, then someone would have said something. So if you look at Christianity and the way it rose, when you hear the story about the guards saying that, well, let's say the disciples stole the body, I would say that is a form of enemy attestation. But another thing is that we would expect that if you have these Christians causing this ruckus and really stirring the pot, then if the authorities wanted to kind of crush that movement, all they had to do is like say, you know what, these guys are getting on my nerves, go get the body and just like throw it in the middle of the town, and so they can all just shut up. But they didn't. They could have. So yeah, I agree with him that I would say does lend a type of credibility or credence to the fact that had it been there, it could have been used against them and just shut it up to Christians in the first place.
That's great. Yeah. Oh, we got a lot of comments from Steve. I guess he's doing like this show on his channel soon with Hugh Ross for Reasons to Believe. So yeah, that's going to be a fun matchup to see between the two of them. That's going to be great.
Yeah.
How you've been in how many debates in the last couple of years? 4, 5, 6, or a lot?
Myself?
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Because you debated Matt Dillahunty. I watched that I think a year ago. Tell us about that. What was that experience like?
It was good. I really enjoyed it. Me and Matt have become somewhat friends over the past few years.
Oh, that's cool.
I really liked it. It was definitely interesting, especially having someone like Matt. You know, I don't mind going on record and saying Matt. He's a good debater. He's now I'll say this too. It's if you debate someone who doesn't take a position, then as much as I love Matt, I don't think people who don't take a position should be debating unless that's kind of known to everybody. Because usually, like say there's a voting poll and I said we're going to vote for Proposition 8, yes or no. You know, there's two boxes you could put your ticket in, your ballot in. Yes box on the left, no box on the right. If someone comes up and says, I don't know, where do I put this ticket? Well, I don't need that ticket. I don't want that ticket. I need a yes or no ticket, right? So I think if someone comes to debate, they should take a position. So when you don't take a position, it gets, in my opinion, makes the discussion less interesting because you're not presenting anything per se of a case. You're just attacking the other person's case or just saying, I'm not convinced. And saying you're not convinced isn't a convincing argument against a person's case. Nevertheless, I did enjoy it. I think it went great. It's on my channel, and then I did like 3 highlight videos, kind of touching on some things. And the the pastor who hosted that debate at his church, actually asked if I'd come back about a week after the debate to the radio studio that he has. And we did like a little debate debrief review on that I really enjoyed, where we got to unpack a little bit more stuff because it's such a deep topic that even in just 2 hours, I mean, you know, you can barely scratch the surface.
Yeah, totally. So is that what you're offering as a critique, that he didn't really take a counter position? He was just kind of doing
playing skeptic?
Playing skeptic to your presentation. Is that the critique?
And I think that's something that he would openly accept, because even in the debate he says, you know, sometimes the best answer is I don't know, and that's fine, but I want to debate someone who claims to hold a position or belief on something.
Were you offering as a proof of soul though? Because that's legitimate if you were saying this proves a soul, because then all he's got to do is expose the flaw. So were you offering it as a syllogistic proof? I don't remember off the top of my head.
I mean, the arguments I gave, would lead to a soul. That, in other words, I'm either a purely physical object, physicalism is true, or I'm an immaterial substance, a soul. Well, if one of the things we didn't get into was, like, let's say free will. If I'm a purely physical object, I don't have free will. So I'm either a purely physical object or I'm an immaterial substance. If I am a purely physical object, I don't have free will. If I do have free will, then I must be more than a purely physical object. Therefore, I must be a soul. And again, you know, it'd take me some time to unpack that. But when you get a syllogism where, look, I either do have a soul or I don't. If I don't, here's the conclusion that leads to, but I know this isn't true. Therefore, I must have a soul. Right. It's kind of the thing that I did with Skylar. If belief A implies B, but B is false, then A is false. I mean, it's a basic rule of logic. If P, then right. Q, not Q, therefore not P. So if you can show that, well, here are the 2 options, and I know that if this option is true, this must be true, but I know this isn't true, therefore this option must not be true. And if it's an either or, then you go
right. It's an argument by dichotomy. Is that what they call it? An
sure.
Argument by dichotomy.
Haven't heard it put that way, but I mean, I'd be fine with calling it that.
Yeah, it's dichotomy. If I prove this false, then by extension, the dichotomous is its opposite is the truth.
Right, A or not.
The
A,
implications, right. Yeah.
Does it square though with the belief versus ontology? Oh, I'm sorry. What?
No, go ahead, Craig.
Does it square though with the belief versus an ontology? Because atheism is a belief, and you were using it, the dichotomy, to prove the ontology. Like that's where. Do you understand the question?
Yes. So what I was talking about before was either physicalism or substance dualism. Soul or not a soul. But with regards to atheism, no, I think it would work the same way if we say that if there is no God, then these implications would follow. So when I say if atheism's true, I don't mean if what an atheist believes is true per se. I mean if atheism, the position that there is no God.
Right. So it's an ontology versus it's a negative ontology versus an ontology. It's not quite a belief versus an ontology. Gotcha. Correct.
Right.
Okay,
Gotcha. Like I'm a Christian, and Christianity is certainly a set of beliefs, but those beliefs can be true or false. So,
but we believe those beliefs because there is a God, guys. That's why we believe the beliefs. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and so if one of the core tenets of Christianity is that God exists, obviously if God didn't exist, then Christianity can be true. Even though Christianity is a set of beliefs and it encompasses a belief that there is a God, disproving that there is no God would prove that my beliefs are false, and hence Christianity would not be true. So
right.
Yeah, even though there are beliefs, I'm not talking about, well, if we only look at beliefs versus ontology is what you're saying. It really is it's either A or not A kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right, totally.
And we got some questions in the chat as well. If you wanted to sort of give some of your thoughts or opinions on your recent debate with Skylar.
I'm working on a review video, a commentary video. So I've done one. I did one with my debate with Dillahunty. I did one in my debate with Tom Jump.
I know you. Yeah, those are always great.
And then I did one on the question I asked Arn Raw, where he flipped out, and that actually got a lot of attention and traction. So much so that he invited me on his show to talk. That's a whole nother story. But I'll be working on one.
I got to check that out. I haven't seen that. You got to come back and tell us about that.
Yeah. What I said about the Skylar debate is I said on a scale from 1 to Arn Raw, the Skylar debate was about an 8. So it wasn't as bad as my debate or discussion with Arn, but it was up there with in terms of all the shouting and interruption.
He didn't listen to your argument. He didn't. What at the first part of when you were doing your presentation, someone was like, "Is Skylar asleep?" He didn't listen to it, and he was going, "I'm not an atheist, dude. I said I'm not an atheist." Like, okay, but that's got nothing to do with what he's saying, and you're not understanding because you didn't listen to his argument. It's like, all right, we got it. You're not an atheist, but you are aware that there are these people out there known as atheists, correct? And whether you are in fact one of them, totally irrelevant to his argument.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly right. So I'll be working on a video where, in fact, I've with the whole COVID thing going on, work's a little bit different, but it's still keeping me busy with a lot of other stuff. So I'm gonna try to work on that, and I wish I could snap my fingers and put it out there. But anyone who's seen my commentary videos know I don't just kind of record. Not that I have a problem with that, but I record and I put a lot of edits in it. I have ADHD, so my mind is always thinking of things. So when you look at my videos, you see animations and videos and clips, cut scenes that cut to other things, and it's just kind of how my mind works, and I think it's funny.
Yeah, they're really funny.
So I say that to say I enjoyed it. I think if anybody who's an honest, unbiased, objective observer looks at that debate, I think it's clear, and not that I'm just concerned about winning. That wasn't even my point, but I think it's clear who had a rational position that they're willing to defend, and who was yelling and talking over the other person, and I would even dare say being hypocritical with some of the accusations being lodged and even projecting, but I'll save that for the video review.
For the analysis. I put out I don't think I'm going to post it, but I have a play-by-play on it. Yeah, I'll probably post it.
Nice. Okay.
It's basically what I just said. The one time he started trying to play you instead of argue the argument. That's my main critique of him. It's street tactics. He starts trying to get inside your head instead of examine the structure of your argument and break down the argument. He didn't listen to your argument. He can't even summarize it. He started saying things that were totally not germane to the argument you were making, as if they settled the case. And then he started trying to play you. So that was my offhand analysis. Are your balls tingling? Come on. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think he expected a type of reaction out of me. It's really hard to upset me. It's really hard to offend me. And if there's going to be any atheists listen to this who in the future are going to debate me one day, it's a bad tactic. It's not going to work on someone like it. You're not going to offend me to where you're going to get me upset. You're going to get me laughing. I genuinely think I'm kind of messed up in the head. I have ADHD. I think those kind of things are funny. So I'm not easily offended or anything like that. So, and I think sometimes some people rely on those kind of tactics. In fact, when he talked about my testicles twice in a row, the first time I laughed, the second time I was just like, that's not even funny. And like, wow.
You're trying to
guess
get
you
in my
really don't-
head. You're trying to rattle my cage. It's really obvious. You
And
know,
aside from that, it's like, I think like, wow, I think you generally just don't have anything else to say, and you probably think you're losing the debate. So the only thing you can do is throw mud.
well, so Matt Dillahunty didn't do that in your structured debate. When
No,
he's
no,
on
no.
when he's on Atheist Experience, he does use disruption and street tactics, and he's great at it. But he doesn't do it in a formal debate because he realizes it make him look. People are there to see you dismantle the argument, not try to mess with the person's mind. If you mess with the person's mind, it makes you look bad. Period.
Yeah, and I've talked to Dillahunty, and I even did an interview with him where I interviewed him. He was part of one of our conferences. He did a debate for us. And I don't know if it was in that interview or somewhere else, but he even said himself, he's different than when he's on the Atheist Experience versus when he's in person. He said, yeah, it's a different type of setting. But yeah, no, he certainly didn't do what Skylar did, and I think there are much better representatives of atheists and agnostics than Skylar. That if people want to listen to those kind of people, there are much better representatives than Skylar.
Gotcha. Questions, John?
Yeah. We got another one from Steve McRae, and I need to correct myself. It's Steve McRae is going to be appearing on the Reasons to Believe channel to speak with
Even
Hugh
better.
Ross. Yeah,
Nice.
yeah. So he's asking, does Eric hold that existence is discrete, as in exists in jumps of being destroyed and coming back into existence, de novo and ex nihilo, or contiguous, future has causality / continuous?
So I'd probably have to have him unpack a little bit what he means by that latter part. I don't think I'm familiar with the way that's phrased, but I'd say I don't think something can come into existence twice. So there has to be some type of continuity that does continue, something underlining any kind of change. That's why when I was talking with Shannon, I said, I just, you can hold a position where this would be true, but I don't think it makes sense where you have someone who exists, doesn't exist, and that same person comes to exist again later on. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question. I'll have to have him. Unpack some of that from.
Sure. Yeah, it seems. Yeah, going with the later part, and that seems kind of to be the thing that, at least from my understanding, that makes the separation or the distinction rather between having consciousness and having a soul, because it seems almost like the having a soul has to do with like the continuity of our experiences, whereas consciousness almost seems like just the fact that you can have an experience at a present moment or something like that.
Yeah, because I mean, you could clone me and put my same beliefs and thoughts and experience in another mind, and hypothetically speaking, I don't think you could. Anyways, won't go into that.
Right.
But hypothetically, just because you have someone who looks just like me, thinks just like me, and has those same experiences as me, doesn't mean it's me.
Right.
Not that Steve was saying that was just a tangent.
Right.
How did you like your interview with Shannon? I thought that was, I watched almost all of it. I thought it was really good. What did you think? Yeah,
I enjoyed it. I definitely enjoy. I mean, I definitely don't mind disagreement. Of course, I mean, you can't, in the kind of stuff that we do online and debates and stuff like that, you have to have a bit of tough skin and whatnot. So I don't mind disagreement. What I don't like is when someone's actually not trying to have a conversation, then it just becomes kind of tiresome at some point. Unless it's entertaining, like it was with Skylar. Right. But I really enjoyed the discussion with Shannon, because here's someone who is giving me time to talk, even though she disagrees, and then pushing back with fair questions, and then letting me push back. So there's a back and forth where there's actually a fruitful conversation that's getting somewhere, as opposed to, talking about.
I mean, that's what Shannon does. She's civilized and respectful first and foremost, which you kind of have to be if you're going to talk about complex things and disagree about it, because she's interested in the substance of your disagreement. She's she's has integrity in that regards, right?
Yeah. And the best way to have a conversation or even a debate, the best way to have a good debate, whether you quote win or lose, is you have to understand what the other person is saying. If you don't understand what the other person is saying or arguing, you have nothing to respond to. And if you
Right.
start responding without knowing the other person's position, then you're making yourself look like an idiot.
An
And
idiot, a
you're
meathead.
not,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
and it shows that you're not genuinely interested in hearing what the other person has to say. Whether you agree or not is almost irrelevant. It's, am I taking the time to actually listen to you and respond to what you're actually saying instead of responding to a straw man?
Right. And Shannon, as far as you were concerned, Shannon parsed out everything you said, listened, probably repeated it back to you a few times and understood it.
Yeah, and there is times which is expected, where she's like, well, I don't know if I fully understood this, but let me ask this, and maybe this will, so those kind of things show that the person is at least trying, because yeah, it's a complicated topic to talk about, but that's the point of conversation, right? If I say, well, let me see if I understand you. Is this what you're saying? And I might say, no, let me try it again. Okay, so is this what you're saying? No, let me try it again. Even if that's all that happens, a lot more than that happened, but even if that were all that would have happened, it still shows that these two people are actually trying to understand each other. And that's what makes a discussion fruitful. That's what makes a debate interesting, is when you're actually addressing the points the person is saying.
Right. She's still giving you a fair hearing and you're still getting to present your case. She's not falsely objecting to something, in a way that shows that I understand. Any other questions, John?
Yeah. So another question from Mark Angelotti. How can we demonstrate that a soul exists or does not exist? Like, is this sort of like a falsifiable hypothesis?
Yeah. So first thing I'd say is, who cares whether it's falsifiable? And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I say that because some people still have these outdated beliefs, and I don't mean that rudely. These outdated beliefs that a criteria for something being meaningful or something being true is that it can be falsified. There's a lot of things that are not falsifiable. It doesn't mean we don't have reasons to believe them. So, in fact, the very idea of falsification is falsibility falsifiable. If it's not falsifiable, then I could use the same objection against the idea of falsibility as a criteria for knowledge or truth or getting at something. Is it falsifiable? I'd say yeah. I'd say that anything to an extent is falsifiable. If you can show that there's a logical inconsistency or contradiction within a set of beliefs, then by default that thing cannot be true. If I believe that married bachelors exist, then by definition those things cannot be the case. If I say, some people ask me, well, we know the soul doesn't exist because we haven't found the energy it's made of. Well, time out. If you believe that I believe in a soul made of energy, then automatically it's not a soul we're talking about if we're talking about something physical with physical characteristics, because then we're not talking about something immaterial. So that would be a contradiction, right? So yeah, there's various ways of doing it, but ultimately it's going to come down to, if you can show that I am not the same person from one moment to the next, if you can show that I don't have free will, that would at least push the bar that way, because I would argue that the soul is ontologically necessary for free will. It doesn't guarantee free will, but it's at least necessary for the possibility of free will. If you can show that consciousness is indeed physical, or you'd have to show that consciousness doesn't exist. If you could show that consciousness is something that is third party accessible, that's something we didn't even get into. I could summarize it by saying, a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he could never know more about my mental life than I do, because my mind is not something anyone can observe with any kind of instruments. They can observe my brain, but not my thoughts. And I've had people say, we can observe consciousness. How? We look at the brain. Right. What do you see? Neurons firing. Right. That's it. You don't see, when I talked to T Jump, I said, if you picture a pink elephant, is it in your brain? Yeah. And he actually said yes. And you can go watch that for yourself. But if you can show these things are actually, quote, in the brain, and their consciousness is reduced or identical to something physical, then sure, there's no soul.
What is an example? You said that the falsifiable thing gets thrown around a lot. What are some examples of things that are not falsifiable and yet we know they're true? If you know, I don't know.
Yeah, and this goes into, and I'm sure Steve would appreciate this. Some people think that there's a certain level of that certainty is a necessary requirement from something like knowledge. I cannot prove to you that I cannot falsify the belief that the past was not just created 5 minutes ago, and I was created 5 minutes ago with just a set of beliefs. I can't falsify that that's not the case. I can't prove it's not the case, but I have no reason to believe it.
Well, I can. We've been streaming for an hour and a half, so it couldn't have started just 5 minutes ago.
Right. And
John
the person would say,
yeah.
And the person would say, well, no, we were just created 5 minutes ago, and it was just at that time that it's as if we've been streaming for, whatever. We just have these memories.
We backloaded a whole hour and 24 minutes.
The classic, am I a brain in a vat? How do I know there are other, the classic tedious philosophical problems that I guess we presuppose them, right? Are we going to have to do, are we going to have to do that with morality too? Presuppose it?
What do you mean?
Well, we presuppose the questions that you're talking about, we presuppose how I'm not a brain in a vat, things like that, because you can't falsify it, right? Is that that's what I thought you meant?
So I'm not a precept. I don't know if you guys are or not. I'm not a precept apologist. I get accused of it. Are you guys, out of curiosity?
No, I'm interested in some of the argumentation. I'm interested in some of the ideas.
So I would say I wouldn't say we're quote presupposing them. I would allude to something like properly basic beliefs, where these are beliefs that are justified, that are not justified on the basis of other beliefs, but they're believed in a basic way. So the belief that I exist, I didn't come to the belief that I exist on the basis of evidence or prior beliefs. It's in fact something that I just find myself believing, that's naturally justified in believing. And now that doesn't mean I can't give justification for it. I just don't think a quote, any type of a justification of a prior based belief is needed for these kind of things. I think they're self-evident or intuitive. 2 + 2 = 4, 1 + 1 = 2, I think is a self-evident belief. It's not as if I need to justify it on the basis of something else per se. Again, not saying I can't, it's saying I don't think those things are needed. So the belief in that the past wasn't just created 5 minutes ago, it's not as if I began to investigate that and look into it. I think it's something that I find myself believing, and that's natural for me to believe, and I have no reason to reject it. So I take the position that beliefs, I would say, beliefs are innocent until proven guilty. When people say, well, could it be possible that we're in the Matrix? I say, sure, but why would I think that? Well, they say, well, is it possible? Sure, but why would I think that? Well, it's possible, right? It's also possible we're not in the Matrix, so that doesn't do anything. I need a reason to believe it or a reason to reject a belief.
Right. So I used presuppose wrong. I guess I meant a priori, a language.
Yeah, that'd be fair.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's a good point that you bring up, that just because something is possible doesn't mean that we should have any reason to believe it, because exactly the opposite could be the case. So.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I think that's it.
Is that it?
Yeah. I guess I did have my question. I don't know. It's sort of to do with panpsychism. I'm wondering though, if consciousness is built up like emergently from the base underlying parts of matter that have a psyche to themselves, would that sort of then make personhood a degreed property? Because if like what it is to be a person is to have some sort of consciousness, then somebody that has more mass or more a larger brain, perhaps, would that then mean that they have more personhood to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. I'm not sure how they would. So that question could be separate from the question of consciousness, because someone like Hume would take a bundle theory of being a person, where a person is just anything is just a bundle and collection of properties and parts. That gets into a whole other set of problems. But I think someone could hold to panpsychism, and two people can hold to panpsychism and both have differing opinions of personhood. Right. So I don't know if there's one answer that would necessarily follow from panpsychism with regards to personhood, but sure. That's a good question.
But yeah, and the one thing I know, like sort of the problem with panpsychism, that I don't know if there's been a satisfying response to it, is the combination problem, where if you have a small amount of psyche within every, or potentially within every single atom of the universe, and then you just combine all those things, how is it that we can have a unified experience rather than a large collection of micro experiences?
Right. And even the problem with emergence is, and there's so many ways we can go to, but yeah, and you know, why does one brain only produce one consciousness? Why not two consciousnesses? Why is the consciousness take two halves of a brain? I mean, there could be someone who only has half of a brain and still be conscious. You know how? So yeah, there's a lot of other question begging assumptions that go into that, and there's the argument from the unified visual field that we didn't get into. But yeah, no, there's a lot of, we barely scratched the surface.
Yeah. Okay. Because I was going to ask if you're aware of the neural binding problem, which is sometimes used by people in the philosophy of mind for the soul.
Is that, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's what I'm talking about, and I do remember the phrase. But go ahead and.
Right. Yeah. So that we have each of the sections of the brain that are in regards to different parts, like we have the visual cortex and we have the hearing, all of those things, but we don't have any sort of part of the brain that is supposed to unify all of those things together.
Right. Yeah. So it's a binding problem. Yes. Yeah. And now I was right on track with that. I just wanted to be sure. So Eric LaRocque is a philosopher who studied neuroscience and philosophy of mind, and he gives an argument from what's called the unified visual field of consciousness. And basically, I'll give the argument by way of illustration, and I use my own. I modify his illustration. Suppose you have 10 chefs, and each chef is going to work on the recipe for a cake, but you only give one part of the recipe to each chef. So, and you put each 10 chef in a room, in their own separate room, and you lock the doors. And you kind of get on top of the roof and you get a bird's eye view of what they're doing. Is anybody baking the whole cake? No. In fact, in order for a cake to be baked, you're going to have some type of a master chef to take all the pieces of the recipe that each chef is individually working on and put it together to form the cake. So you need a master chef for that. Another illustration I've thought of is like, you know, if you get a book and you tear out chapters and have each person read a chapter in different parts of the room in a house, is the whole house reading the book? No, you still need someone to bring all that together, right? So with that in mind, from neuroscience, and I even brought this up with Shannon, and you know, she did concede that, yeah, you know, we don't have anything that puts it back together. We now know which part of the brains are correlated and associated with processing different parts of the visual field. So when you look at an object, one part of your brain is associated with a color, another part of the brain is associated with a size, another part of the brain is associated with a shape, another part of the brain is associated with its movement, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at an object, you don't only see black without shape, or you don't see you don't see a computer without color. You see something unified, but there is no part of the brain that kind of puts these things back together. So in a syllogism, you could argue, I'm either a purely physical object or I'm an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then I cannot have a unified visual field. Third premise, but I do have a unified visual field. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul.
Right.
Yeah.
I know Aldous Huxley, he actually has sort of a form of panpsychism, but rather than like every single molecule or atom in the universe, it has some amount of psyche to it. Rather, the universe itself as a whole has a consciousness to it, a universal consciousness, and the brain is the limiting factor that makes it so that there is a single unified experience for the things, for the brain, for the owners of that brain, I guess.
That's what I said. Esoteric, third way, those are the only options.
Yeah.
Esoteric, weird, heavily influenced by Eastern mysticism. Third way options like, you know, it's just a unified consciousness, man.
Right.
Here.
Yeah, that reminds me of even John Sorrow has what he calls a Chinese room argument, and if we keep talking, I'll keep bringing stuff up, so you have to forgive me. But anyways, yeah, it's basically the idea that you get, because people are talking about AI, artificial intelligence, will they be conscious, whatnot. But he basically says, look, if you put somebody in a room and you say, you know, and you have the slot in the door, and the person can't get out of the room, well, one person puts in a piece of paper, and they don't know that there's someone inside this room. And this person gets this piece of paper and sees these squiggly lines, and he has a book and he has a paper, and the book says, when you see these squiggly lines, you know, go into this basket and pull out the note that has the squiggly lines and give it back to the person. So you get these notes, and you look it up, and and then you grab the right piece of paper and you put it out. You have no idea what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Unbeknownst to you, you're actually corresponding with people in Chinese. And suppose you have this practice down to a T, where you have it so well that the people on the outside actually think you're incredibly fluent in Chinese, but you don't understand a word of Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what that shows is that just imitating consciousness doesn't mean something's conscious. It takes more than simply the behavior patterns to have or identify consciousness, because consciousness is not physical. But what some people have objected to his argument is saying, well, okay, maybe the guy inside the room doesn't know Chinese, but the whole entire room as a whole understands Chinese. And that's kind of the same objection. And he just kind of like, that's incredible. I have no idea how you would get that from what I said.
Yeah.
And this, mind you, is an atheist. John
It's
Sorrow.
weirder. It's weirder than the problem. Let me ask you a problem based on, question based on a couple of things you brought up. You mentioned Plantinga a few times, so I'm assuming you know him fairly well, and your basic beliefs. And can you
Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga.
Plantinga?
Yeah.
And properly basic beliefs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, and basically what I said is it's a belief that is not based or founded or justified on a prior belief. So
Right.
the belief that I exist is not, if someone says, why do you believe you exist? Well, because I started studying now. It's not based on something prior. It's
I read it in a
belief,
book somewhere.
Yeah, right. It's a belief that you, for whatever reason, have, that in a sense, it's something that you find yourself believing in a natural way that didn't take any type of rigorous intellectual effort.
Right, but he uses, I'm talking about in terms of the Thomas Aquinas sensus divinatus. He uses it as a kind of proof of God argument or epistemological argument for God.
So right, so Plantinga says that belief in God is the same way, and I think I'd agree with him. Not that he needs my agreement by any means, but yeah, that belief in God is properly basic, and
Right.
and I would agree with that. And I would even go as far as to say what I said earlier.
It's probably basic for the person that undergoes some sort of like spiritual or numinous experience, right?
Yeah, that any kind of religious experience, or I think he is the example that you're just kind of, let's say you're walking out one day, you're walking to the park and you see the sunrise, and you're overwhelmed by this immense sense of beauty that you just think something had to create that. That's a properly basic belief. And like I said, I think beliefs are also innocent until proven guilty. Now, he wrote 3 volumes on epistemology, so I couldn't, there's so much more that he said to it, and I am by no means, specialized in this kind of field. But what he's basically getting at is any objection to this is going to have to basically assume that there is no God in order for the objection to even work in the first place. But if there is a God, then those people are justified in their beliefs in a properly basic way.
Right. So until a defeater for the belief in the existence of God is there, then their belief is still justified, right?
Yeah, it's a type of justification that overrides any opposing kind of defeater. So, for example, let's say if you were accused of yesterday, like let's say there was a crime committed and you were accused of that crime, you say, wait a minute, no, I know that wasn't me because I was at home.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, was anybody with you? No. Was anybody around? No. Did you text or call anybody? No. Well, how do you want us to believe you? Now, even if you can't prove you were at home, you were at home. And they say, well, look, we found your fingerprints on the gun. How do you explain this? You think, I don't know, but I know I was at home. Okay, right. We found this, So even if you have this justification that overrides these posing objections towards what you're saying, but that you were in fact home. And I mean, how would you get out of something like that, Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a type of properly basic belief that would even override these supposed objecting, alleged undercutting defeaters that come against you.
Right. To assume your religious belief is false, if you experienced it directly, they are presupposing you wrong and you in error and you deluded.
Right.
You believe yourself right. When an atheist is saying provide evidence, they mean prove it to me. And probably you can evidence it to yourself to truly, in order to truly know if I'm telling you the truth, I would have to give you tools to evidence it to yourself. I don't think I could ever prove to you my internal subjective experience. It's like, tell me, prove you have a headache, Craig. Prove to me you have a headache, Craig. How do you know you have a headache, Craig? Well, trust me, my head is killing me. How do you know, Craig? Do you got any evidence? It's killing. That's what I'm trying to parse out on my channel. It's really complicated, though. It's really complicated.
And that's why Craig says that there's a difference between knowing Christianity to be true versus showing Christianity to be true. I can know Christianity is true, but that may not apply or do anything for you. But I can also show you reasons why you ought to believe in a rational type of thought that Christianity is true, even if those reasons didn't per se persuade me in the first place. And some atheists say like, oh, well, you didn't kind of believe in God based on that. And I'd say you're right. But I kept my faith and belief in God based on this. I could say that, I could say, yeah, but in the midst of doubts and troubles or whatever the case, what have you, these arguments did indeed do something to my trust and confidence in who God is. I mean, the more knowledge you gain of God, which is part of the greatest commandment, then the more you're going to fall in love with them and trust them.
Right. And the only thing I think you could do is give somebody who doesn't believe you the tools to evidence it to themselves, to have the experience. That's the only way I think you can circle the square. That's my guess. I don't foresee any other way. But John, did you want to say something?
And ultimately the Holy Spirit, we
convicts their heart.
The Holy Spirit's gonna use what we do, just like evangelism or preaching or anything else.
Right. Did you hear that, atheist? Give me the tithes. You're as good as converted. Give me the tithes. Might as well give me the tithes now because you're as good as converted.
Right. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I was just going to ask you if there's any like books you would recommend for some of the stuff you've been talking about, maybe by J.P. Moreland or Plantinga. I'm not sure.
Plantinga has a book called Warranted Christian Belief. I believe it's a red book. So it's a 3-volume set. It's much more in depth. One of my favorite books on the soul by Moreland is called Body and Soul. Human Nature and the Crisis in Ethics by J.P. Moreland and Scott B. Ray. That is my favorite book on the soul because it goes into not just the arguments for the soul, but goes into the implications of how it deals with personhood and ethics and things like abortion, euthanasia, in vitro fertilization, cloning, things of that nature, and how personhood is at the center of all these type of issues and questions. So I think the question of the soul is one of the most important questions there is. Within the and even arguments within the Christian arsenal, because it's a lot of it is just, in my opinion, so self-evident and properly basic that you have to convince yourself otherwise. I have more confidence that my soul exists than I do my body. How so? Well, I could be mistaken about which body part's mine, but I could never be mistaken about which thoughts are mine. I could wake up in the middle of the night and not know that a piece of my body's missing, or be confused about, my arm could be numb. There's times where I felt for my arm and my arm's not there, but it was just numb. But I'm never confused about which thoughts are mine. Anyways, I keep going, but that book, Body and Soul by Moreland, is a great one. There's one that's written at an academic level. I think it's called Consciousness and the Argument from God, or The Existence of God and the Argument from Consciousness. It's a blue book. And then just the Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. That's just one of my favorite books. In fact, I have the newest edition. I have both editions. The old edition, or the first edition rather, is signed by both William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. This is the second edition. It's a great book, even just to have and keep just for reference. I love this stuff.
Fantastic. John, that was fantastic.
That was great. You want to sign us out, Craig?
Do you want to say your goodbyes, Mr. Eric?
Sure. I appreciate you guys having me on. It's always a blessing to kind of just be with other brothers and sisters in Christ, and even just take questions and give reasons for what we believe. To those non-believers out there listening, if you're genuinely curious and seeking, keep going, keep seeking, keep asking questions. I apologize on behalf of any Christian who's been a jerk to you or has not given you sufficient reason and evidence, but just know that if they do that, they're not following what Scripture tells them to do, which is to give an answer and to love God with all their minds. So don't blame Christ for what Christians do, and keep seeking, keep asking, and genuinely seeking and asking. And if there's a way we can help, obviously within the confines of having a full-time job and married and 2 kids and whatnot. But let us try and be a resource. And I say this respectfully, don't be lazy. I've had atheists say, what's your argument for this? I'm like, I have a 2-hour video on that. If you really care about what I believe, go watch the video. If you don't, I'm not just going to argue over.
Don't waste my time. Go away. Either grow up or go home. Those are your options. Yes, totally. And hook us up with the tides. John, should I close this out, or you got anything left to say?
No, go right ahead, Craig.
So there you have it, kids. This was great little chat with our friend, and hopefully you come back sometime in a few months and tell us where you're at and what's been going on. And with that, we are signing off.